The moment didn't explode the way people expected. It slipped in sideways, wrapped in a smirk, delivered with just enough casual arrogance to make it easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. Russell Vought didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. He mocked. And in that split-second exchange with Jasmine Crockett, something shifted in the room. The cameras caught it. The audience felt it. And Washington insiders immediately knew this wasn't just another sharp remark in a routine hearing. Because when power mocks accountability, the fallout never stays contained, and what followed set off a chain reaction no one in that chamber could control. The session sat quietly on the congressional calendar, indistinguishable from dozens of other oversight hearings that rarely break out of C-SPAN obscurity. No packed gallery, no dramatic lead-up, no expectation of fireworks. These are the kinds of hearings staffers half-listen to while drafting memos, the kind producers don't bother flagging for primetime. Most of the public never hears about them unless something goes terribly wrong or unexpectedly revealing. That low-stakes atmosphere matters because it changes how people behave. When no one expects accountability to turn sharp, officials relax. Answers get looser. Tone slips. The guardrails that usually keep exchanges polished start to fade. That was the environment in the room, procedural, sleepy, almost mechanical. Questions were expected to be technical, responses carefully hedged, and then everyone would move on. That assumption created a false sense of safety, especially for someone used to navigating these settings without resistance. In Washington, boredom is often mistaken for neutrality, but it's actually an opportunity. When attention drops, power feels less observed. And when power feels unobserved, it reveals itself in small, telling ways that no one thinks will matter until they do. Russell Vought carried himself like someone who had already run the scenario in his head and liked the outcome. His posture, his pacing, even the way he paused before answering signaled familiarity with the process and comfort with the imbalance of power that usually defines these rooms. This wasn't his first time under questioning, and it showed. He spoke in polished policy language, the kind that sounds substantive while carefully avoiding vulnerability. Each response was framed to project competence and control, as if the hearing were less an inquiry and more a formality he was there to manage. That confidence wasn't accidental. It was built on the expectation that tough questions could be softened with jargon and that follow-ups would remain respectful, even deferential. In environments like this, confidence can operate as a shield, discouraging challengers from pushing too hard. But confidence has a tipping point. When it stops being grounded in precision and starts leaning on status, it subtly transforms into dismissal. The more secure he felt, the less effort he put into calibrating tone. What he likely viewed as ease read to others as entitlement. And once that perception sets in, every word that follows is filtered through it, whether he intended it or not. Jasmine Crockett approached the exchange without theatrics, which in that setting was its own form of disruption. She didn't rush to score a point or deliver a viral soundbite. Instead, her questions unfolded deliberately, each one narrowing the scope of acceptable answers. Rather than allowing broad generalities, she pressed for specifics, tying abstract policy language to concrete outcomes. The cadence mattered. It signaled preparation and intent, not performance. That approach quietly shifted the balance in the room. Officials accustomed to surface-level challenges often rely on momentum to escape scrutiny, but her pacing denied that escape. Each pause forced attention back onto the substance of the response. She also avoided personal framing, keeping the focus on decisions and consequences rather than personalities. That restraint deprived the exchange of easy distractions. As the line of questioning developed, it became clear she was building something cumulative, not episodic. Each answer fed the next question, tightening the frame. This method doesn't create immediate fireworks, but it creates pressure. It invites mistakes, tonal slips, and reveals priorities through what is emphasized or minimized. In hearings like this, methodical questioning is often more destabilizing than overt confrontation, because it exposes discomfort without ever naming it. It wasn't a dramatic interruption or a sharp retort that changed the temperature. It was something far subtler and, in many ways, more revealing. As the question landed, there was a brief flicker of amusement across Russell Vaught's face, a smirk that appeared before the words followed. That fraction of a second did more work than any sentence could. In professional settings, especially under oath and on camera, facial expressions communicate intent as clearly as language. The smirk suggested not confusion, not disagreement, but dismissal. It carried the implication that the question itself was beneath serious consideration. For those watching closely, the message was unmistakable. This wasn't a debate between equals in that moment. It was a quiet assertion of hierarchy. The room registered it immediately. Body language has a way of cutting through procedural noise, and this gesture did exactly that. It reframed the exchange from policy discussion to power dynamic. Even before the answer was finished, the tone had already been set. What might have otherwise passed as routine testimony suddenly felt charged. The smirk lingered in the air, coloring the response that followed and altering how every subsequent interaction would be interpreted. Once that line was crossed, there was no returning to neutral ground. Mockery introduces a different set of rules into an exchange that is supposed to be governed by formality and restraint. It signals that the speaker no longer sees the interaction as a good faith inquiry, but as a performance of dominance. In a congressional hearing, that shift matters because it reframes the entire purpose of the proceeding. Questions are no longer treated as requests for clarity. They become obstacles to be brushed aside. Once mockery appears, even briefly, it invites the audience to reassess motives. Viewers stop weighing the substance of answers and start evaluating respect, credibility, and power. This is where stakes rise. What was once a technical discussion becomes symbolic, standing in for broader frustrations about who gets dismissed and who gets protected in institutional spaces. Mockery also collapses plausible deniability. Disagreement can be debated, but contempt is instantly recognizable. It bypasses ideology and lands on instinct. For the person on the receiving end, responding emotionally can seem justified but risky, while staying composed shifts the burden back onto the one who mocked. Either way, the exchange is permanently altered. From that point forward, every answer carries the echo of that gesture, and every viewer watches not just for information, but for exposure. There was no audible disruption when it happened, no gavel strike or sharp intake of breath that would signal a clear break in decorum. Instead, the reaction unfolded in the quieter language of a room full of people trained to notice shifts in power. The first sign was stillness. Conversations stopped mid-whisper. Hands paused over keyboards. Eyes that had been drifting toward notes or screens lifted back to the exchange. These are not dramatic responses, but they are telling ones. In institutional settings, subtlety is how acknowledgement is expressed without escalation. Everyone in the room understood that the tone had changed, even if no one said it out loud. Staffers, especially, are attuned to these moments. They are there to anticipate fallout, to sense when a line has been crossed before it becomes public. A glance exchanged between aides can communicate more than a spoken objection. In this case, there were those brief, almost imperceptible looks that signaled recognition. Not shock, but awareness. This was no longer routine testimony. Something had slipped past the usual filters. Members of the committee reacted differently, but just as meaningfully. Some leaned back, reassessing the exchange. Others leaned forward, paying closer attention than they had moments before. No one interrupted, which in itself was significant. Interruption would have turned the moment into a procedural dispute. Silence allowed it to breathe. It let the gesture stand on its own, uncorrected, unchallenged, and therefore more exposed. This kind of reaction is familiar to anyone who has spent time in hearings. There is an unspoken understanding that not every breach needs to be addressed immediately. Sometimes the most effective response is to let the record capture it. Cameras were still rolling. Transcripts were still being generated. The room collectively recognized that the moment had already been preserved. What made the reaction especially potent was its restraint. Had there been outrage, it might have diffused the tension. Instead, the quiet recalibration sharpened it. The exchange continued, but under a different weight. From that point on, every word carried added significance, not because it was louder, but because everyone was listening differently. Jasmine Crockett's response to the moment was defined less by what she said and more by what she deliberately chose not to do. In settings like this, the expectation is often that mockery will provoke an emotional counterpunch. That reaction is predictable, and predictability is easy to manage. Instead, she maintained her composure, neither acknowledging the smirk nor adjusting her tone in response to it. This refusal to engage on those terms disrupted the dynamic more effectively than a sharp retort would have. By not reacting, she denied the mockery its intended payoff. Her posture remained steady, her voice even, and her questions continued along the same line she had already established. That consistency sent a quiet message to the room. The focus was not going to shift. She did not allow the exchange to become personal, and in doing so, she protected the integrity of her line of questioning. This approach forced the attention back where it had been before the gesture occurred, but with an added layer of tension. The mockery was now unaddressed, hanging in the air, unclaimed and unexplained. Strategically, this mattered. Responding emotionally might have satisfied viewers looking for confrontation, but it would have also reframed the moment as mutual escalation. By refusing to take the bait, she kept the imbalance visible. The contrast between her restraint and his tone became the story without her ever having to name it. In professional settings, composure under provocation often reads as authority, especially when the provocation is subtle enough to be denied but obvious enough to be felt. There was also a longer-term calculation at play. Hearings are not just about the immediate exchange. They are about the record that survives afterward. Video clips, transcripts, and summaries rarely capture nuance evenly. A calm continuation is harder to mischaracterize than a heated response. By staying on script, she ensured that any later review would show a clear asymmetry. One party focused on substance, the other momentarily distracted by tone. That choice shifted the burden. Anyone uncomfortable with what had just occurred was now left to sit with it. She didn't defuse the tension. She preserved it. And in doing so, she allowed the moment to grow in significance as it traveled beyond the room, framed not by reaction, but by restraint. As the exchange moved forward, the questions and answers no longer existed in isolation. Each response began to accumulate weight, not just on its own merits, but in relation to everything that had already been said and shown. What might have sounded like routine policy language earlier now carried a different resonance. The earlier gesture had recalibrated how listeners interpreted intent, and that recalibration made patterns easier to spot. Statements that leaned heavily on abstraction started to feel evasive. Qualifications that might once have been read as nuance now appeared carefully engineered to avoid commitment. Crockett's methodical approach amplified this effect. She didn't pivot away from the substance or soften the line of inquiry. Instead, she continued drawing connections between stated principles and practical outcomes, inviting answers that would either align or conflict with the record. Each answer was implicitly measured against prior testimony, public statements, and the real-world implications of the policies under discussion. The stacking wasn't loud or dramatic. It was cumulative, building a framework where inconsistencies could be sensed even before they were explicitly named. This is how credibility pressure works in formal settings. Rarely does it hinge on a single contradiction. More often, it emerges when multiple answers begin to rhyme in uncomfortable ways. Listeners start noticing what is emphasized repeatedly and what is conspicuously avoided. Over time, that repetition becomes its own form of evidence. The hearing began to feel less like a series of discrete questions and more like a slow reveal of priorities. The earlier mockery only intensified this dynamic. Because tone had already drawn attention, viewers were more alert, less willing to grant the benefit of the doubt. Every deflection stood out more sharply. Every appeal to process sounded more self-protective. What was being built wasn't just a factual record, but a narrative one, where demeanor and substance reinforced each other. By the time this phase of the exchange settled in, it was clear that something was taking shape beyond any single answer. The evidence was not arriving as a dramatic revelation, but as an accumulation of small, telling choices. And once that accumulation reaches a certain point, it becomes difficult to undo, because it feels earned rather than imposed. Almost immediately, the exchange began to exist in a parallel ecosystem beyond the hearing room itself. In today's media landscape, hearings are rarely confined to the chamber. They are designed, or more accurately, inevitably repurposed for the clip economy, where a few seconds of video can travel faster and further than any transcript ever could. The smirk, brief and almost imperceptible in real time, suddenly took on outsized significance once cameras captured it. Social media users, producers, and staffers alike recognized the moment as inherently shareable, and that recognition transformed it from a subtle in-room gesture into a viral signal. Context began to compress. What might have been one exchange in a long procedural session became a distilled narrative about tone, attitude, and implied contempt. Algorithms don't care about nuance. They amplify clarity, emotion, and recognizability. In this ecosystem, a smirk is louder than an entire paragraph of explanation. The clip doesn't need policy breakdowns. It needs tension, and this moment had it in abundance. Staffers and media operatives understood this instinctively. Within minutes, the portion of the hearing that contained the gesture was isolated, replayed, and prepped for circulation. Decisions about which seconds to highlight and which frames to freeze were made strategically, not randomly. The narrative was already escaping the room before the formal conclusion of the hearing. Analysts knew that viewers wouldn't watch the full session. They would consume what was visually arresting and emotionally resonant. The smirk, paired with Crockett's composed follow-through, provided exactly that dynamic, a visual and psychological contrast that told a story without any words needing to be added. The consequences of this are profound. Once a moment enters the clip economy, it takes on a life of its own. Each repost, each snippet, each commentary layer adds reinforcement. Viewers begin to interpret subsequent answers, statements, and even press coverage through the lens of that one visual cue. It is no longer merely a single data point in procedural history. It becomes a shorthand for character, judgment, and institutional behavior. In practical terms, the clip becomes a preemptive framing device. Audiences who encounter it first carry that framing into every later engagement, subtly coloring perception of credibility, intent, and authority. What starts as a small gesture in a quiet hearing room can, within hours, become a defining moment of public discourse. And in that system, first impressions are not just lasting, they are amplified. Predictably, once the clip began circulating, supporters and allies of Vought moved quickly to contain the narrative. They framed the moment as harmless, insisting it was merely a joke or a misinterpreted expression. Taken out of context became the dominant line, repeated across statements, social media posts, and talking points. The goal was clear: minimize the perceived disrespect and neutralize the emotional weight of the exchange before it could take root in public consciousness. These defenses rely heavily on ambiguity, banking on the idea that viewers might give the benefit of the doubt if the framing is consistent and immediate. In this case, however, ambiguity was limited because the smirk was visual, unmistakable, and reinforced by the stark contrast of Crockett's steady composure. It had already been amplified through multiple layers of video, making it difficult to dispute. Supporters attempted to shift attention back to the substance of the hearing, emphasizing the technical aspects of Vought's testimony, his qualifications, and the broader policy context. This is a familiar strategy in Washington. Drown the visual or emotional narrative in procedural or policy details to reclaim control. Yet, the very act of defending the moment so urgently suggested that the clip had resonance beyond a passing remark. When explanations arrive too quickly or too forcefully, they can have the opposite effect, reinforcing the original perception rather than dissolving it. Meanwhile, political commentators, journalists, and social media users began dissecting the clip in real time, replaying it frame by frame to analyze every nuance of expression and posture. What was intended as lighthearted or dismissive suddenly became evidence of attitude, arrogance, or disregard for accountability. Each new share, each new analysis, added cumulative weight to the perception that the moment was meaningful. Supporters could argue intent all they wanted, but in a landscape dominated by instant visual communication, perception often outweighs explanation. The speed at which the clip traveled forced rapid narrative management. The initial attempt to reframe was not just about protecting Vaught's reputation in the moment. It was about controlling the long-term framing that would persist in media coverage, social media discussion, and the broader political conversation. Yet, the very need to rush to reframe confirmed the potency of the moment. The more the defenders pushed to contextualize or downplay it, the more attention it drew, highlighting the very dynamic they hoped to suppress. In trying to quiet the moment, they unintentionally amplified its significance. This moment resonated far beyond the immediate confines of the hearing because it tapped into a pattern of experiences that many Americans already recognize in their own lives. It wasn't just about a smirk or a clipped answer. It was about who gets treated with respect and who gets dismissed in positions of authority. Viewers instinctively understood the dynamic without needing a policy briefing or a transcript. There is a visceral familiarity in seeing someone in power display subtle contempt, particularly toward a person who is calmly holding them accountable. That contrast, mockery versus measured composure, strikes a chord because it mirrors real-world experiences of hierarchy, dismissal, and the frustration of being ignored or underestimated. It became relatable on an instinctive level, which explains why the clip traveled so quickly beyond the halls of Congress. The context of the moment further amplified its resonance. Crockett wasn't just any lawmaker. She represents a constituency and an ethic of accountability that viewers respect. Her steady focus on consequences and record-keeping highlighted not just the policy stakes, but also the human element of governance. The juxtaposition of her discipline against Vaught's dismissive tone created a narrative that transcended technical details. It was about character, priorities, and the subtle ways authority is wielded. People respond to visual and behavioral cues more powerfully than to words alone. And in this case, those cues told a story that viewers could interpret without commentary. Social media accelerated the moment's reach and impact. Platforms designed to reward clarity and emotion made the visual contrast between mockery and composure instantly shareable. Each repost reinforced the interpretation that this was not merely procedural decorum but a meaningful clash of temperament and approach. Analysts, journalists, and everyday users layered context, commentary, and opinion onto the clip, magnifying the stakes. It became more than a single exchange. It became shorthand for broader conversations about power, respect, and institutional accountability. Finally, the moment's resonance was heightened because it left space for interpretation. There was no immediate resolution, no apology, no overt confrontation that would have neatly concluded the narrative. That ambiguity forced audiences to draw their own conclusions, filling in the gaps with their own sense of fairness, outrage, or validation. By allowing viewers to project their experiences onto the exchange, the moment became emotionally contagious. It wasn't just a hearing. It was a lens through which people could see broader patterns of behavior in authority, and that is why it lingered in public consciousness far longer than the hearing itself. At first, mainstream media coverage treated the exchange as a minor, even amusing moment, something to note in passing rather than a story demanding deep analysis. Headlines focused on the procedural aspects of the hearing, the broader policy discussion, and the predictable back and forth between lawmakers and agency officials. The smirk and subtle mockery were acknowledged, but only as a footnote, a fleeting visual in the long stream of congressional proceedings. This initial framing is typical. Outlets often wait to see whether a moment gains traction organically before dedicating significant coverage. What sets the Vought-Crockett exchange apart, however, was how quickly audiences began amplifying it on their own. Social media users, independent journalists, and political commentators started isolating the clip, replaying it, and commenting on the contrast in tone. The virality forced a recalibration in coverage. As the clip circulated, journalists who had initially dismissed it as inconsequential were compelled to revisit the narrative. Analysts began dissecting Vaught's body language, Crockett's composure, and the broader implications of the exchange. It became clear that the moment carried more than superficial drama. It revealed behavioral patterns, power dynamics, and questions of accountability that resonated with a wide audience. Newsrooms pivoted, updating stories, adding visual evidence, and contextualizing the exchange within both policy and character-driven frameworks. The tone of coverage shifted from procedural reporting to narrative exploration. This slow pivot illustrates the modern media cycle. While editors and reporters often attempt to control framing, audience engagement frequently dictates what receives attention. The clip's virality created a feedback loop. Public interest drove coverage, and coverage reinforced public interest. Analysts and political commentators began producing explainer segments, highlighting the asymmetry between mockery and restraint, ensuring that viewers who hadn't seen the hearing understood the stakes. By the time coverage had fully shifted, the exchange had moved from a minor procedural moment to a widely recognized touchpoint for discussions about tone, authority, and institutional behavior. The media's pivot was deliberate but reactive, a calculated recognition that the moment had transcended its immediate context. What began as a subtle in-room gesture had become a focal point for both reporting and analysis, demonstrating how viral moments in hearings can reshape public perception and drive the narrative in ways that formal proceedings alone rarely achieve. Behind the polished exterior of the hearing, pressure was quietly mounting, even before the public fully absorbed what had happened. Staffers and aides, trained to anticipate the ripple effects of every gesture and word, recognized that the smirk and subsequent exchange were far from trivial. In these moments, internal conversations begin almost immediately. Questions circulate about whether damage control is necessary, how to frame responses to the press, and whether talking points need to be adjusted on the fly. Every advisor knows that a seemingly small misstep can metastasize once it reaches the clip-driven media ecosystem, and that recognition alone creates urgency. The calculus behind the scenes is precise. Timing matters, phrasing matters, and a delayed or mismanaged response can amplify the very moment they hope to neutralize. For Vought's team, the challenge was balancing defensiveness with authority. Push too hard to explain or justify, and the mockery becomes magnified. Ignore it, and the narrative risks defining his credibility in the eyes of the public. Allies and communications staff weighed every option, debating whether to issue clarifications, contextual statements, or strategic silence. In political environments, silence can be a weapon, but it can also be a liability if the audience interprets it as indifference or weakness. Every choice carried the potential to alter perception, and every delay increased the chance that the moment would spiral beyond control. Opponents, conversely, sensed opportunity. They understood that viral gestures often carry more persuasive power than policy arguments. Each subtle smirk, each brief moment of condescension, becomes a symbol easily amplified and repeated in messaging. For Crockett and her supporters, the exchange was a visual tool, one that could be leveraged without any additional statements. The tension behind the scenes was therefore a balancing act on both sides, where every decision had to anticipate not just the immediate political consequences, but the broader narrative momentum building in real time. By the time the hearing adjourned, the pressure had already migrated from the room itself into the larger ecosystem of strategy meetings, social media monitoring, and editorial discussions. The exchange had escaped procedural confines, leaving behind a trail of calculated anxiety, rapid-fire decision-making, and high-stakes anticipation. Staffers recognized that controlling the fallout was no longer just about managing optics. It was about shaping the story before it shaped itself, and that awareness alone changed the way everyone involved approached the next steps. Jasmine Crockett's approach in the aftermath of the exchange highlighted a strategic restraint that amplified her position far more effectively than a confrontational response ever could. She didn't deliver a dramatic monologue, call out Vought directly, or demand apologies. Instead, she maintained focus on the record, letting her questions, demeanor, and calm composure speak volumes. In a setting dominated by optics and rapid interpretation, restraint can function as a form of authority. By refusing to engage in reactionary posturing, she drew attention to the contrast between measured accountability and dismissive mockery. The absence of a speech became a tool in itself, allowing the moment to reflect poorly on Vought without her having to amplify it verbally. This strategy also strengthened her credibility. When lawmakers respond emotionally, they risk having their own behavior reframed as overreaction. Crockett avoided that trap entirely. Every subsequent question reinforced her seriousness and command of the subject, emphasizing policy outcomes, oversight responsibilities, and tangible consequences. The visual and behavioral contrast had already been established, By continuing in that vein, she ensured that the audience interpreted the earlier smirk in context, recognizing it as a lapse in professional decorum rather than a minor quip. Crockett's decision also leveraged the long-term mechanics of political narratives. Viral moments are fleeting, but when paired with calm, consistent messaging, they become embedded in the public record. Analysts, journalists, and constituents reviewing the hearing later would see a clear asymmetry. One party focused on accountability and substance, the other momentarily distracted by tone and posture. That asymmetry shapes perception in ways that short-term reactions rarely can. Moreover, her restraint forced the burden of interpretation onto others. Viewers, commentators, and even Vought's own team had to process the smirk without her adding commentary, which magnified its impact. The audience was left to judge character and priorities independently, which often results in stronger impressions than guided explanations. In effect, Crockett allowed the moment to exist in its purest form, unmediated, and in doing so, transformed a single subtle gesture into a compelling demonstration of discipline, focus, and positional strength, reinforcing her authority without ever uttering a dramatic line. As the footage and transcripts of the hearing circulated, a pattern began to emerge that reinforced a growing perception of hypocrisy. Observers noticed not just the smirk or the tone, but the contrast between Vought's public statements about accountability, respect, and professionalism and the behavior displayed in the hearing. Moments like this are particularly potent because they are tangible, visual, and verifiable, leaving little room for plausible deniability. Analysts and political commentators quickly framed the exchange within a broader narrative, one in which someone preaching diligence and decorum failed to demonstrate the very qualities they demand from others. This frame, once established, becomes sticky. People don't just remember the policy discussion, they remember the incongruity between words and behavior, and that incongruity starts to define credibility. The hypocrisy frame is powerful because it taps into universal expectations about fairness and consistency. Audiences instinctively assess whether someone practices what they preach, and violations resonate more strongly than minor policy disagreements. In this case, Vaught's dismissive tone, captured in a brief smirk, amplified the contrast between his stated principles and his conduct. Every carefully crafted talking point, every defense claiming humor or misinterpretation, had to contend with the visual evidence of incongruence. The more explanations were offered, the more the frame solidified, because repeated justifications can paradoxically reinforce the sense that the original behavior was out of line. Crockett's calm, disciplined posture only accentuated the frame. By refusing to escalate or dramatize the moment, she allowed the audience to see the asymmetry clearly. One participant adhering to principles, the other undermining them with demeanor. That contrast did more to cement the narrative than any explicit accusation. Observers across political divides could identify the tension between conduct and rhetoric, making it a broadly relatable touchpoint. Once the hypocrisy frame locks in, it shapes how all subsequent statements and actions are interpreted. Every policy pronouncement, every public appearance, is now filtered through the lens of credibility or the lack thereof. What might have been a routine exchange becomes a reference point, a shorthand for evaluating judgment, character, and integrity. In this way, a single, fleeting gesture, captured on camera and amplified by contrast and context, transforms from an isolated moment into a defining element of perception, making the narrative difficult to reverse or neutralize. What makes moments like this so consequential is their permanence and visibility. Unlike a misstatement that can be clarified or a policy decision that can be recontextualized, body language and tone leave an indelible record. Vaught's smirk was brief, but it was captured on camera, frozen in time, and instantly replayable. It exists outside of explanation, outside of intent, and outside of any accompanying rationalization. In hearings like this, gestures speak louder than words because they feel authentic, unscripted, and instinctive. Even if he offered an apology or explanation later, the visual imprint had already cemented itself in the public and political consciousness. The human brain interprets visual cues more immediately than verbal context, and that creates a gap between what someone says and what the audience perceives. Complicating matters further, the moment occurred against a backdrop of heightened attention to tone, respect, and institutional accountability. Crockett's composure accentuated the contrast. By remaining calm and disciplined, she made the smirk appear sharper, more pointed, and more intentional, whether it truly was or not. Once that perception exists, reversing it requires more than a statement or clarification. It demands consistent behavior over time to rebuild credibility. In the meantime, the narrative takes on a life of its own. Analysts, journalists, and social media users have already interpreted the visual evidence, layered context onto it, and circulated it widely. The public doesn't wait for a full transcript or a carefully worded press release. Impressions form immediately, and first impressions tend to stick. This is also a lesson in procedural permanence. Hearings are meticulously recorded, archived, and made available for public review. That creates a kind of accountability that is immune to spin because the original record is always accessible. Clips can be replayed, dissected, and shared endlessly, creating cumulative reinforcement. Every time someone revisits the exchange, the impact is renewed. Unlike words that can be clarified or misquoted, gestures cannot be amended. They exist as unchangeable data points. The inescapable visibility of the moment ensures that it cannot simply be walked back or minimized. It has already become a reference point, a shorthand for both the dynamic between the participants and for broader questions of professionalism and respect in positions of authority. The instant capture, the contrast with Crockett's measured approach, and the viral amplification collectively make the moment permanent, forcing it to remain part of the narrative long after the hearing concludes. Even before the gavel officially closed the hearing, the fallout from the exchange was already unfolding. The room had settled back into procedural rhythm, but the energy had shifted. Staffers and aides were quietly recalibrating, knowing the moment had already escaped the chamber and entered a broader arena where it would be dissected and amplified. The dynamics were no longer contained to the formal questioning. They had migrated into the realm of perception, where tone, posture, and composure mattered more than transcripts. For many in the room, the question was no longer about policy details but about managing the narrative that was rapidly taking shape online and in press coverage. Allies of Vought recognized the stakes. Damage control had to be assessed in real time. Which clips would likely circulate, how pundits might frame the exchange, and what messaging could blunt the growing perception of disrespect or condescension. Opponents, meanwhile, saw an opportunity to capitalize on the contrast between mockery and measured professionalism, preparing to amplify the narrative through social media, press releases, and post-hearing commentary. Each team understood that viral moments don't wait for procedural closure. Once they are in circulation, they begin shaping impressions that can influence public perception, fundraising, and political positioning long before any formal outcomes are decided. Meanwhile, Crockett's presence and approach continued to reinforce the asymmetry. Her calm, disciplined questioning and refusal to escalate kept attention on substance, leaving Vaught's demeanor isolated and magnified. Observers outside the chamber, journalists, analysts, constituents, were already forming judgments, dissecting the clip for tone, intent, and character. That external attention forced both sides to operate under pressure they could not fully control. The narrative was already self-propagating, and every passing minute without a statement or clarification only reinforced the visual contrast and its implied message. By the time the gavel formally concluded the session, the exchange had moved beyond procedural impact to strategic significance. It had already become a touchpoint for storytelling, political framing, and audience interpretation. What began as a fleeting gesture had evolved into a catalyst, shaping perceptions, influencing discourse, and setting the stage for subsequent political maneuvering. In essence, the fallout had preceded the conclusion, proving that in high-stakes political environments, a single moment can define the narrative before any official resolution occurs. The most powerful aspect of the exchange wasn't a line of questioning or a pointed response. It was the way it ended, unresolved, leaving a lingering tension that refuses to fade. Once the hearing concluded, there was no dramatic confrontation, no apology, no definitive resolution to frame the moment neatly. Crockett had maintained her composure, Vought had not offered clarification, and the room had returned to procedural business. That absence of closure transformed the encounter from a single, fleeting incident into a narrative with life beyond the chamber. Unanswered moments are inherently compelling because they invite interpretation. Audiences are left to draw their own conclusions, filling the gaps with their expectations, biases, and understanding of fairness. In politics, ambiguity is a double-edged sword. It can frustrate, but it also makes the moment stick, circulating long after the formal session has ended. The unresolved nature of the exchange amplified its psychological weight. Viewers, staffers, and political observers found themselves repeatedly revisiting the clip, reading into micro-expressions, and dissecting every syllable of speech. Because the mockery was unaddressed, it became a touchstone for broader themes of accountability, respect, and power dynamics. Crockett's calm restraint meant that she didn't dictate interpretation. Instead, she allowed the audience to perceive the imbalance for themselves. That autonomy in framing makes the moment more persuasive. People trust what feels unfiltered and spontaneous, particularly when contrasted with carefully managed political messaging. The lingering effect also impacts subsequent discourse. Every statement, every policy announcement, and every public appearance by Vought is now filtered through the memory of that exchange. Analysts and commentators continually return to it as a reference point, using it to illustrate tone, temperament, and credibility. The unresolved ending transforms the incident from a procedural hiccup into a cultural and political touchpoint, a shorthand for broader patterns of behavior in positions of authority. Ultimately, the power of the unanswered ending lies in its ability to create ongoing engagement. It doesn't conclude neatly because the audience is meant to keep watching, analyzing, and interpreting. The ambiguity invites repeated attention and discussion, sustaining momentum in ways that scripted confrontations rarely achieve. What began as a subtle smirk and a composed line of questioning has evolved into a persistent narrative that continues to shape perceptions, influence discourse, and demand scrutiny, ensuring that the moment resonates far beyond the walls of the hearing room.